Begin transmission, First Officer. Pull us out if we get pinged.
Aye, aye, Captain.
Happy Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death Day. On this special day, we will be talking about why the revolution started in the first place. There are many people who point to many different things as to why we started the revolution in the first place, and it becomes quite confusing. Ken Burns' famous documentary, The American Revolution, that was revealed a while back, tried to answer this, and it was received with very high praise. But there was one thing that he missed, that he didn't talk about, that to us is really, really important and recontextualizes everything about the revolution. I understand that there's so much to talk about, and he really can't talk about everything. But again, in our opinion, you can't talk about the revolution without it, because it's so imperative to how we got here in the first place that without talking about it, it leaves people to thinking wholly different things about the revolution. But when you include it, this was a worthy cause to fight for. And without it, a lot of people were like, why did we need to fight this revolution again? Which to us is a very dismissive and dangerous attitude to have. What are we talking about? Well, let's begin with the infamous Tea Act, where it all started. Obviously, we know about the Tea Act. Parliament passed it in 1773. The Act reinforced a tax which many Americans considered flagrantly unlawful. The last remnant of the 1767 Townshend Acts, all of which, except for tea, has been repealed in 1770. But how high or how much taxes the Americans had to pay was hardly the point. There are at least two major reasons as to why the Americans vehemently opposed and hated the Tea Act. A, they believed that taxation without representation nor consent was unlawful. They believed that taxation without consent was simply theft. For only through a representative legislature could the people consent to taxation. Also, the Tea Act was to be used for the support of royal governors and other royal dependents in America, thus making the royal administration entirely dependent on the crown and independent of the people whom it is supposed to be governing. And B, the Tea Act, and B, this act also required that Americans solely and exclusively buy their tea from the East India Trading Company, a monopoly created by the British government, as opposed to buying their tea from other places, such as local stores or smuggled Dutch tea, without having the said company pay taxes for it. To put it into context, this would be like if you wanted to go out to buy a cheeseburger, but the American government forces you to only go to McDonald's, while paying generally high taxes for it in the process, even though In-N-Out is right there next to you, while McDonald's pays next to nothing for it. Compounded by the fact that the Americans knew that the East India Trading Company was viciously irresponsible, ruthless, and greedy to a very inhumane degree. The documentary addressed this. So, what did he miss? Well, it's that the East India Trading Company, in their corrupt mismanagement and greedy behavior, directly led to the deaths of in the Great Bengal Famine of 1770. And man-made famine, or genocide in this case, where the policies of the East India Trading Company allowed for the genocide to happen. Yes, genocide. If a man-made famine is considered a genocide, then the Great Bengal Famine of 1770 definitely counts as a genocide. Let's go 5 years earlier to 1765. The trading company acquired the right to acquire the Diwani, otherwise known as the peasants' tribute, from the Mughal Empire, where prior to 1764, this tribute has been approximately 10 to 15% of the agricultural output of the peasantry. But the trading company raised that rate to 40% and even to 50%. In addition, they outlawed the hoarding, quote-unquote hoarding, of rice and other staples. India had a standard practice, which was to put aside a portion of rice and other staples and in the reserve, as they have had many experiences with famines in the past. The company wanted to maximize profits, so they outlawed this practice. So when the eventual monsoon failure and drought hit in 1769, the company's horrific policies created the famine conditions that led to the modern estimates of 10 million dead. That's 1/3 of the entire population of Bengal. That will be the equivalent of over 300 million Americans perishing overnight. And do you know what the kicker is? They weren't even growing tea there. They were growing opium instead, so they can buy tea imports from China. No staple for the locals to grow is a man-made condition to create a man-made genocide. And do you know what the company's response to the famine was? Oh, they just raised the tax rate to 60% and resorted to violent measures to collect the taxes. According to Warren Hastings, the first Governor General of British India, it was naturally to be expected that the diminution of the revenue should have kept an equal pace with the other consequences of so great a calamity. That it did not was owing to its being violently kept up to its former standard. This behavior didn't stop and continued for well more than a century, where history repeats itself with the 1943 famine, killing up to 3.8 million people. And word of this genocide spread to America. The newspapers in 1771 ran excerpts of a letter from a gentleman in India. On our arrival here, we found a river full of dead human carcasses floating up and down, and the streets crowded with the dead and dying, without anyone attempting to give them relief. So horribly has the famine raged here, that they who were able to walk and procure food for themselves were so accustomed to see their fellow creatures perishing before them, that it did not even create a painful emotion. The numbers that have perished in Calcutta alone only amounted, while they found it impossible to keep up an account, to 10 to 12,000 a week. But afterwards, they became so numerous that they were every morning just gathered together in a heap and thrown into the river without any possibility of numbering them. I have myself passed by and seen 20 or 30 lain down to die in the length of one street. I have beheld the hapless infant tugging at the empty breast of its mother, just expiring, without being capable of affording them the smallest aid. The dying mothers have frequently been delivered of the fruit of their wombs in the streets, and both have immediately been swept up amongst the dead. It was no uncommon sight to see dogs running about with human limbs in their jaws. And I am told that many of the expiring wretches were seen gorging on the bodies of those who perished within their reach.
He said the same thing he'd been saying for hours. Burn them all.
And when the Tea Act was being debated, The Tea Act pushed and lobbied for it, influencing Parliament to pass it. Parliament knew what it was doing. They were just as culpable. This Tea Act wasn't just about tea. It was also about helping pay for the trading company's financial troubles, almost as a reward for committing genocide. That tea was blood tea, all the while forcing Americans to buy their blood tea through their monopoly. And a series of agitational pamphlets called The Alarm circulated in Boston in 1773, calling for refusing to accept the tea brought by the British East India Trading Company from India to America. Rusticus writes, "It was easy then to predict that the East India Company would someday or other have a baneful influence on the politics and constitution of that nation. Incorporated by Queen Elizabeth, favored by her successors of the Stuart line, who were always necessitous, and sold the royal munificence to them for immersement and repeated bribes." In another Alarm pamphlets, Rusticus also wrote, "Are we in like manner to be given up to the disposal of the East India Company, who have now the assurance to step forth in aid of the minister to execute his plan of enslaving them? Their conduct in Asia for some years past has given simple proof how little they regard the laws of nations, the rights, liberties, or lives of men. They have levied war, excited rebellions, dethroned lawful princes, and sacrificed millions for the sake of gain. The revenue of mighty kingdoms have centered in their coffers, these not being sufficient to glut their avarice. They have, by the most unparalleled barbarities, extortions, and monopolies, stripped the miserable inhabitants of their property, and reduced whole provinces to indigence and ruin. 1,500,000, i.e. 1.5 million, it is said, perished by famine in 1 year, not because the earth denied its fruits, but because this company and their servants engulfed all the necessaries of life, and set them so high at a rate that the poor cannot purchase them. Thus, having drained the sources of the immense wealth, they now, it seems, cast their eyes on America as a new theater whereon to exercise their talents." And in the Alarm number 2, Rusticus once more writes, "It was fully proved to you in my first number that the East India Company obtained their exclusive privilege of trade to that country by bribery and corruption. Wonder not then that power thus obtained at the expense of the national commerce should be used to the most tyrannical and cruel purposes. It is shocking to humanity to relate the relentless barbarity practiced by the servants of that body on the helpless Asiatics, a barbarity scarce equaled even by the most brutal savages or Cortez, the Mexican conqueror. There were even protests and boycotts by women's groups in colonial America, such as the Society of the Patriotic Ladies in North Carolina, issuing a pledge against the tea. Farewell the tea board, with you gaiety attire, ye cups and saucers that I did admire. To my cream pot and tongs I now bid adieu. That pleasure's all fled that I once found in you. No more shall my teapot so generous be in filling the cups with this pernicious tea. For I'll fill it with water and drink out the same before I'll lose liberty, that dearest name. Before she shall part, I will die in the cause. For I'll never be governed by tyranny's laws. So well knowing where these taxes were going towards, it would make so much sense to protest these awful enabled policies, where on December 16th, 1773, dressed up as natives, not just to hide their identities and express that they identified themselves as Americans, no longer considered themselves British subjects, but also in solidarity, in their own indirect way, with the Indians of Bengal, to mock and to say explicitive you to the East India Trading Company, boarding 3 ships containing the company's cargo and dumped 46 tons of the tea into the harbor. The genocide in Bengal in 1770, and the Tea Party 3 years later, and the subsequent revolution is one of the biggest causes and effects in history. Without the genocide, who knows how the revolution would go? If there will be a Tea Party or not, because the Tea Party was the inciting incident for the revolution. There was no going back after that. Safe to say, the British were furious that their blood tea was dumped into the harbor. And with that, the British responded with the Intolerable Acts. And from there is history. I want you to see the forest for the trees here. If Britain can easily commit genocide in millions against one of its colonies, then who's to say that America wouldn't have been next? This is the thought process of a lot of anti-crown, pro-independent Americans. They weren't going to want to support a genocidal trading company by being forced to buy their blood tea. What reason would they have to allow Britain to force upon America the corrupt class of royal toadies who would rule America by force, as they did in East India? Would they allow Britain to siphon off the productive wealth of Americans and gladly watch Americans die in order to enhance their own corrupt profits? Why? Why would they want to enable this genocidal behavior any longer? One side of a war doesn't need to be morally pure in order for it to be the obvious choice of support. Yes, America committed horrific and evil actions, but one is obviously more evil and horrific than the other, to the point where it's ridiculously trivial and pettifogging to equate the two. Otherwise, we will put the Allies on the same moral condemnation of the Axis for actions like Dresden, and that's obviously horrifyingly stupid. With all of that in mind, you can see how awful the situation really was, how tyrannical it was becoming, if not already at full force, and how this was more than just simply not wanting to pay taxes, as some want to make that claim, no matter how much they want it to be. So why talk about this? Why is the Bengal famine this important over most everything else? Why did this start the revolution? Did nobody not notice that the Ken Burns documentary used subjects when referring to us instead of citizens? I mean, why do you think no taxation without representation was so important? The focal point. The phrase used to explain why we started the revolution in the first place. Except the why. Because the famine revealed a very uncomfortable truth that really lays at the heart as to why the revolution happened in the first place. As to why we revolted and why the revolution was not a civil war, as some academics and historians would like to assert. A civil war would imply that we were citizens when we were not. The British didn't see us as fellow citizens. The famine just confirmed what we already knew, and that the revolution was not only imperative, but a practical necessity. If I can boil the revolution down to at least one phrase, if not a few sentences, it's this. The British didn't see us as citizens. They saw us as subjects. Who in their right, sane mind wants to live as a subject, no matter the benevolence or the safety, or the prosperity, or whatever reason, when they can be citizens of their own country and will fight tooth and nail to acquire it. Think about that the next time someone questions the reason why we broke off. End transmission.